Hi, I'm Wendy Conway-Lamb here at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the lands that I'm talking to you from and where the University of Canberra is located. So that's on the lands of the Ngunnawal peoples. And I pay respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present, and I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today, and any other First Nations peoples from beyond Australia. It's fitting, I think, especially in the context of today's seminar, to recognise Indigenous Australians' thousands of years of continuing care and custodianship of country, which we continue to learn and benefit from. So welcome everyone to this webinar on democratising sustainability transformations. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Please feel free to pop your videos on because we'd love to say hi before we kick off with the presentations. So just to introduce what we're doing here, we've got a joint seminar here, jointly hosted by the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance and the Democracy Working Group of the Earth System Governance Project. And I think most of you know one or both of those, but for those who don't, the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance is based at the University of Canberra in Australia. It's a world-leading centre for research on deliberative democracy. We come from diverse fields, but all focused on how deliberation can empower people to shape the decisions that affect their lives. And lots of you here know about the Earth System Governance Project, which is an interdisciplinary research network advancing knowledge on global environmental change and governance. And it connects some wonderful scholars, lots of whom are here today from across disciplines. And of course, some of us will be coming together again soon at the end of October for the ESG conference in Toronto and online. So I'm really excited about this panel. We're honoured to have four really experienced and fascinating group of four panellists, all bringing a combination of scholarly expertise as well as hands-on practical experience of living and applying democratic approaches to tackling some of our most pressing environmental problems and climate-related challenges. So yeah, look, I don't want to be talking too much. I'm keen to press on with the presentations, but here's how it's going to work. We have four great panelists. Before each one speaks, I'll introduce them one at a time. And each panelist will have 7 or 8 minutes to give their presentation. And at the end of the four presentations, then we'll open it up for Q&A. So please, though, we strongly encourage questions. Hope it's a really nice conversation for the second half of the session. So as your questions and thoughts pop up, please do add them into the chat. And then when we get to the Q&A, we'll go through questions from the chat, as well as, of course, hands up emoji if you'd like to ask your question face to face. So let me start by introducing Jonathan Pickering. Who many of you, of course, know. He's an assistant professor in the Canberra School of Politics, Economics and Society here at the University of Canberra. From 2015 to 2019, he was a postdoc fellow here at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. His research focuses on democracy and justice in global environmental governance. And he's a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Earth System Governance Project. And outgoing convener of the project's working group on democracy. So let me hand over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Wendy, for the introduction. Thanks everyone for coming along today. Many thanks to the Centre and the Earth System Governance Project for hosting the webinar. Both great networks, and it's always really nice to have a chance for those networks to come together and interact. So today I was going to just give a brief overview to set the scene, I suppose, for the discussion, drawing on a paper that members of the working group on democracy and earth system governance have been working on for a while now. In fact, it was something that began pre-pandemic. It saw the light of day earlier this year with a paper in the Earth System Governance Journal on the theme of democratising sustainability transformations. And so I'll start off with by talking about this paper, but it was really more just, I guess, it's launchpad, if you like, for a broader discussion about how this theme is playing out in recent developments, and how we can see evidence for and against the, I suppose, transformative role of democracy in practice as well. So a starting point with the paper was a growing recognition that wide and deep transformations are needed to overcome existing patterns of unsustainability. So addressing challenges like decarbonisation, reversing biodiversity loss and so on require major changes to how we produce our energy and our food, what kinds of buildings we live in, how we travel and so on. And one of the big questions is whether existing political systems are up to the task of achieving these transformations, or whether those political systems need to transform themselves. But surprisingly, in a way, much of the literature on transformative environmental governance has yet to grapple with important aspects of this question, including the role of democracies in helping or hindering transformation. So for those of you who may be familiar with the work of the Earth System Governance Project and sort of science and implementation plan, that is a sort of a bit of an umbrella of sorts for collaborations in the network, our paper kind of sits at this intersection of an interest in democracy and power and in transformations. So one of the initial contributions of the article, and some of you may have seen the versions of this before, is to try to categorise different possible trajectories of transformation towards democracy and sustainability, or away from them. So we have here a bit of a visual depiction of various combinations of democratic status and sustainability or unsustainability, various terms for them in the green, and then we have various trajectories in orange. And most existing societies sort of fall somewhere around here, we might say. Of course, there are variations, but there are different types of transformations possible. Say, a dual transformation involving achieving sustainability transformations through or along with a transformation of democratic practices, or towards what we might call ecological democracy. We might have an effort to achieve sustainability transformation through existing democratic practices, or what we call towards what we might call environmental democracy, or say an eco-authoritarian transformation, right? Achieving sustainability through a shift or perpetuation of authoritarian practices. But to decide which of these pathways should be taken, we need a better understanding of the empirical evidence for when democratic practices might enhance or constrain sustainability. And so this leads us to our research question in the paper, right? What does experience of democratic practices show about their potential to foster or obstruct transformations towards sustainability? And so the paper itself undertakes an integrative review of the relationship between democracy and sustainability. And by focusing on democratic practices, we cover not only, say, entire political systems, but also democratic practices, processes at other levels, say deliberative or participatory initiatives from the local to the global. Right, so our review covers both large N quantitative studies, tests for correlations between democracy and environmental performance at the national level, as well as smaller N studies that relate to, say, individual deliberative forums, mini publics, and so on. And to make the analysis a bit more tractable, I find where my mouse disappeared too, we break down this idea of sustainability transformations into 5 dimensions where transformation may be required, 5 dimensions that could be where the sustainability transformation could occur in a more or less democratic fashion. And in the time that we have, I won't go into the results in detail, but wanted to just highlight a few broad points, and then, well, in the discussion, we can bring out perhaps maybe some of the individual findings as we go along. So at the broadest level, we find that across all 5 dimensions, there's substantial evidence that democratic practices are associated with stronger environmental performance. But we also have some notes of caution. So when it comes to participatory initiatives, and it's no surprise to deliberative Democrats, if participatory initiatives don't offer participants a meaningful opportunity to deliberate, they can tend to enforce an unsustainable status quo and fail to, let's say, move attitudes in a more pro-environmental direction, or reveal common interests in environmental protection. And so this underscores, of course, the need for careful design of these initiatives. And likewise, as I think is often pointed out, in relation to smaller scale deliberative forums or mini publics, these forums exist within a broader configuration of power dynamics. And so no matter how well designed an individual forum is, its ability to engender transformation may be limited unless other aspects of the political system, the deliberative system, if you like, are overhauled. So in this sense, we highlight the importance of other steps towards democratisation, things like fostering a more robust media environment, clamping down on political donations and lobbying that corrupt representative processes, and investing in public awareness and education on sustainability issues. So none of these in themselves are earth-shatteringly new, although if they're all implemented together, they'd still involve a marked shift away from the status quo in most countries. But having said that, even if all the recommendations were implemented, they may still not be enough to achieve the kind of rapid and wide-ranging transformations needed to reverse current patterns of unsustainability. So there may be a range of as yet unprecedented steps required to transform democratic systems. But even so, we want to underscore 2 things, and I'll finish up with these. So first, there's little empirical justification for the eco-authoritarian case, right? So that we need authoritarianism in order to change direction. And second, the environmental case for democratisation is based not just on sort of vague aspirations, but on a solid evidence base as well. So thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jonathan, for kicking us off with that great overview of your review paper. I think we'll get into more of that in the discussion. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Julia Tschersich. Julia is a Junior Assistant Professor of Transformative Governance and Democracy at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. Her research focuses on the governance of social ecological transformations and ecological democracy, and in particular, the role of community-based bottom-up forms of democracy in driving transformation. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Jonathan, for setting the scope so well. My contribution will build on this and focus particularly on, well, ecological democracy, I would argue. Can go to next slide. So my key argument is that we indeed need a strengthened understanding of democracy in order to achieve the kind of transformations that we're looking for, the kind of transformations that we need to tackle these various and interlinked crises of our time are so fundamental that they affect all of broad society. So we actually need to deepen democracy and also strongly consider justice. You can show the whole slide. So I want to argue that such a deepened understanding of democracy needs to reach beyond understandings of democracy that are centered around the nation state, but instead look at more and more complex understanding of not just formal democratic institutions, but also processes such as participation and deliberation, not just on a state level, but also in more bottom-up community-based forms, for instance, of democracy. Or as Smith and Sterling put it, democracy is accessed by the least powerful to the capacities for challenging power. So I want to argue that democracy is intrinsically linked to justice. And that is also the kind of understanding I would argue we need in order to achieve the fundamental transformations of our time. Go on. Go to the next slide, please. We need I believe a multidimensional perspective on justice can help us to enrich our understanding of democracy. The discussions around justice and just transitions have highlighted four aspects of democracy. Procedural justice is about who decides or how transformations in that case can be organized. And this is where democracy or discussions around democracy usually have been centered on, as well as recognition justice. So which kind of perspectives, which kind of voices are being recognized. But I want to argue that we also need to consider more strongly distributive justice and restorative justice. So think about how resources and also the benefits and burdens of transformations are distributed, and how we can restore past and also avoidable damages that are occurring through transformations. Because especially if we're aiming for more, for instance, deliberative processes, it is essentially about also how we can provide the kind of resources for everyone to be able to have a voice in these processes, and with very unequal distribution of time, for instance, or also financial resources, it is very difficult for everybody to participate in a meaningful way. And I would say restorative justice is essential because we also need to consider non-human voices in these kinds of deliberations. Can go on to the next slide. Can go on, please. And this brings me to my last central argument, that we need to connect this to three paradigm shifts that I believe are needed in governance efforts towards reaching transformations. So when we look at the transformation and transition literature, it points us to three paradigm shifts that are required. Paradigms are central leverage points that help us, or that can potentially help us to achieve major changes in the system. So these are points where small changes lead to widespread effects throughout the system. The first one is that we often focus on quite specialized types of knowledge, scientific knowledge, and is often implicitly considered as the most relevant type of knowledge and often valued over more tacit or indigenous types of knowledge. Yet, when we look at transdisciplinarity science or sustainability science, it shows us that it is indeed more pluralist and integrative understandings and more complex perspectives that are required to tackle the wicked problems that we are dealing with. So what does that mean for democracy? We need to consider from procedural justice perspectives whose voices, values, and interests are being heard, and how can we design process in a way to empower especially more marginalized perspectives. And this is linked to ensuring a fair distribution and restoring also damaged livelihoods in order to achieve an equal participation in decision-making processes. The second major paradigm shift is from economic materialism towards post-growth perspectives. So there's a dominant assumption in our system that perpetual economic growth is needed in order to raise welfare. But this growth paradigm that we can see all throughout society has been a major driver of massive environmental degradation, societal inequalities, and also negatively impacts well-being. So I want to argue that we need more post-growth perspectives in order to fundamentally rethink the capitalist structures that are dominant in our society. And how does that relate to democracy? We need to think about a fair distribution, because it's also linked to, for instance, who controls and has access to different types of resources. For instance, in the food sector, we need to think about concepts such as food sovereignty to empower also bottom-up forms of democracy. It means recognizing different types of futures, or perspectives on futures, such as post-growth perspectives, including also post-capitalist and post-development perspectives from the Global South, for instance, such as Wendy Conway-Lamb. And from a restorative perspective, this means enhancing resilience, for instance, through approaches such as agroecology. The third paradigm shift I want to highlight is that we need a shift from anthropocentrism towards reconnecting human-nature relationships. So we see a widespread disconnection of humans from nature, visible, for instance, that production processes kind of take place all over the world, which reduces our perception of the impacts that humans have on ecosystems. So reconnecting people and nature is seen as a very powerful sustainability intervention. From a democratic perspective, for us, this means that we need to more meaningfully represent also non-human voices in nature and process of decision-making, and acknowledge, from a recognition perspective, acknowledge the importance of nature and embracing its intrinsic values. And finally, for instance, through giving legal rights to nature, and finally to actively restore historical or past damages that have been done to the natural world. So to conclude, we need a deepened understanding of democracy that is very much linked to perspectives of justice. And through this, I think we need to do this in order to be able to achieve the fundamental changes that are required. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Julia, for highlighting the multiple dimensions of justice that are relevant to democracy in this context, and really bringing a plural perspective and approach to democratizing social ecological justice and democracy. So thank you. And I will move straight on to Melani Gunatilaka. Melanie has worked with local communities, social enterprises and businesses that aim for social and environmental sustainability since 2013. She's the co-founder of Climate Action Now Sri Lanka. And she's also an Extinction Rebellion member who joined the people's struggle in Sri Lanka as an independent citizen. So I think we have so much to learn from you. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks, Jonathan, for inviting me for the presentation as well. So just to give a little background, I was participating in the people's struggle, the first non-violent and peaceful people's protest that went on for over 120 days, including an occupation, which started as a result of the economic crisis and the forex crisis in Sri Lanka, which is also closely linked to the energy crisis. So to start off with how the protest started, there were pocket protests happening around Sri Lanka, which led to one main protest, which was not organized, on 31st of May near the existing president's house. Jonathan, if you could start with the presentation slide. So This started on 31st of March, where people sort of storming and gathering near President's house, which led to this incident where having a 13-hour power cut in the vicinity of the area. So then it led to a massive protest on 9th of April, where nobody knew who sent out an invitation. And this was mostly organized through social media. One person started posting, and then it flew around, where thousands of people gathered to Golf's Green. And then there were people started an occupation. So I was member of the occupation, and I've noticed several groups and several levels of society joined for the protest for several reasons. So what I noticed was sometimes the activists who've been working on the environmental, climate, social issues, journalists who've been seeking justice, and families of the disappeared, disabled communities. So they all joined the protests as well, but the protest was mainly led by the middle class, who was affected by the economic crisis and the energy crisis. So there were a lot of dynamics, and the land or the protest movement itself was very fast changing. So within the first month, we could see several positive outcomes in Sri Lanka, given we are a multi-ethnic, multi-religious background, with our communities. And there were also racial conflicts that we've had a war that lasted for 30 years, a racial war. So all of these separations disappeared at the protest ground. You could see religious leaders from several different religions coming together and people supporting each other. It was a true demonstration of people caring for people during the first month or so. And even communities like LGBTQ community, who usually gets discriminated due to social stigma, were accepted at the protest ground. And also women, if you read about this, you might know that in Sri Lanka, women are usually not given a prominent place, usually in, similar to most countries in Southeast Asia, that's comes with sort of social stigma and discrimination. But at the protest ground, we could see a lot of women coming forward as well, taking leadership. So the protest was decentralized and it was citizen driven, and there were inclusivity from all of several parts of the society as well. So like I said, within the first month, it was truly beautiful to see how everybody was taking ownership and also everybody was sharing responsibility. And then on the 9th of May, there was an attack, a mob attack released on the peaceful protest site, which led to chaos around the island. So after the protest ground got attacked, people around the island ended up attacking the houses of ministers, and there was arson. There were no, I think, 1 or 2 human deaths as a result as well, but it didn't went into sort of a conflict between 2 parties. So with that change, I could see how the politics or the dynamics of the ground changing, because up until then, people were acting out without fear. They were acting out with the want of contributing to true change. But once the attack released, then everybody, there was fear, there was resentment, there was lack of trust. So with that, there was, it started creating more conflict among the groups as well. So along with this, the political dynamics were also changing in the country. The cabinet was shuffled a few times. The prime minister resigned, the then prime minister resigned, and the current president was appointed as the prime minister at that time. And along with that, there were some changes in the economy and also in terms of the fuel crisis as well, which fuel and energy crisis, which was one of the main reasons for the protests. So when people saw this, their issues somewhat sorted, people took a step back, and then somehow it was sort of a dormant period up until 9th of July. And then on the 9th, we saw massive amount of people coming in and storming presidential secretariats, president's house, and the prime minister's residence, forcing the president to resign. Next slide, please. So after the president's resignation and the appointment of the new president, the movement, I noticed, was divided into two ideologies or two expectations. So one set of people wanted to go for an election by dissolving the parliament, and the other set of people wanted a system change through the change of governance. So instead of top to bottom decision-making that we are currently experiencing, that we currently have in Sri Lanka, they were asking for bottom-up change. So that's what the People's Council started, and we had few meetings that went on leading up to the conversation. In the next slide, I've listed down what were the challenges that we had to face in terms of initiating People's Councils. I'm happy to discuss more and explain these things as during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melani. It's a fascinating topic, and we'd love to hear more in the Q&A. So much more to discuss. So we have one more panelist. I will now introduce Rafael Jimenez Aybar. Rafael is an environmental democracy advisor at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. Over the last 15 years, he's worked supporting parliamentarians worldwide to advance environmental governance through capacity building interventions in collaboration with partners like the LSE Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. So over to you, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and thank you for having invited us on behalf of Westminster Foundation for Democracy to share our experience of this past 2 years since we launched our environmental democracy initiative. I was really flattered because I've been following Jonathan's work for some time, and but I'm delighted to be here. So WFD is the UK's public body dedicated to strengthening democracy around the world. So since 1992, we've been working with parliaments, political parties, and civil society groups, as well as on elections, to help make political systems fairer and more inclusive, accountable, and transparent. So at WFD, we are, of course, aware of the nexus between democratic governance and sound environmental stewardship, and of the research indicating that the ability for democracy to make good of its potential advantages over autocracy to deliver on climate change and the environment depends very much on the quality of the democracy itself. So for us, this means that there are powerful synergies between action to address the climate and environmental crisis and action to strengthen democracy, which is our forte. So to deliver solutions, we need democratic institutions that are durable and effective, systems of governance that are responsive and accountable, and strong political will. Okay, we may have many of these things already in place, and still we don't see a lot of action, at least sufficient action, because on top of that, we believe that we need massive democratic innovation, which we don't really have most anywhere because of the huge changes to all levels of society, politics, and businesses that have been discussed that are required to deliver, for instance, our Paris objective of avoiding disruptive climate change. And then the link works in reverse too, we realize, as negative feedback loops. So many people do not believe that democratic governance can deliver the necessary action because they see no meaningful progress, despite the scientific consensus. And this is against a general background of worldwide democratic decline. So this is why we're not just convinced that without stronger, invigorated democratic practices, we are very unlikely to be able to deliver the objective of the Paris Agreement and others, but also that without decisive climate action, the democracy crisis is only going to worsen, and that even before societal disruptions triggered by climate change start in earnest. So we saw that the opportunities and challenges for advancing environmental objectives democratically are in fact those intrinsic to strengthening democracy itself. In other words, the implementation of any multilateral environmental agreement, like the Paris Agreement or the post-Aichi biodiversity framework, opens many entry points for advancing democracy. And conversely, the democracy support agenda provides many mechanisms for advancing environmental objectives. However, in our experience, advancing what we can call a hybrid programming or blended programming informed by this awareness, which is what we try to do, so pursuing environmental and democratic objectives does bring an additional layer of challenges for organizations like ours, which is funded through ODA mostly. So realizing international environmental treaties, like the Paris Agreement, requires the translation of the commitments into domestic law, the NDCs into national measures and regulations by democratic means. And there, citizens and political parties and journalists and the executive branch of government, and also parliament, not least parliament, they need capacity and resources to use the evidence available to inform and influence policy development and implementation. For instance, few parliaments are holding their executives to account for failing to deliver on the implementation of, the adoption of national legislation on multilateral environmental commitments that is landing their NDCs into the local context. And they're failing to legislate with sufficient ambition. We know that. So we believe that we need to work to expand the political space available to political leaders so that they feel capable of being as bold as they need to be. Also, the ownership by the people of these policies, which will be inevitably disruptive, needs strengthening. So this is why we believe that democratic innovations like rigorous deliberative democracy interventions are indispensable to go beyond business as usual. And I mean meaningful interventions, like high up on Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. So implementing the NDCs, for instance, provide not just opportunities to work on issues of inclusion and political voice, it actually requires to do so. And then mass media and social media platforms are fundamental to strengthening and shaping political voices because they can take on the role of mediator between government and the public. But state or private controlled media can affect environmental outcomes negatively as well through spreading disinformation or restricting access to information. So if the media is to provide constructive channel for political voice, journalists need to be well informed and able to draw on experts on environmental topics. We're trying to work on that. And also it's vital that there is transparency about the sponsorship and ownership of media outlets, particularly regarding links to fossil fuel interests. So this is another entry point. And what about civil society and social movements? We know that in many cases, they have been instrumental to change environmental policy and practice on topics ranging from environmental justice to divestment. And they need capacity support and help to access the key spaces of decision-making. And this is also something that we're trying to do. Then, of course, political parties can help by mediating public preferences and political voices, by holding governments accountable on environmental actions, and of course, through party competition. But there is a need for more awareness, we see, of environmental issues and policy responses available to climate change among political parties, and that is where international support can help. I could go on and on about opportunities, or rather urgent needs, but now I'll go on to the challenges that are specific to this work. In fact, they are not primarily methodological challenges. We already have environmental democracy indicators and political economy analysis methodologies, and there I would like to acknowledge the impressive thought leadership that WRI, the World Resource Institute, has been exerting of late on this field. But what we see is that there are mostly barriers to integrating environmental democracy governance into foreign aid. We come across three significant barriers to advance environmental democracy programming. And these barriers are hindering the integration of environmental democracy interventions into development cooperation on environmental issues more broadly. I mean, broadly speaking, they are related to knowledge gaps and framing gaps in donor agencies, which reverberates into inadequate funding strategies and cycles. The funding cycles are very short, and then development funding is also siloed. And there is an overall strategic deficit. And last, there are also gaps in measurement and reporting methodologies for them. For example, measurement systems for environmental and climate change programs are too focused on indicators related to physical output and emission reductions. So there is a knowledge gap around how to measure environmental change in governance change in your environmental program, and also how to include relevant indicators in the reporting systems. But we are optimistic that there is evidence growing about how integrating governance priorities into technical environmental programs can help increase the effectiveness and the sustainability of the interventions. And there are examples that are emerging on the explicit integration of environmental and governance, human rights, and democracy objectives at the strategic level into foreign aid, and on the use of longer-term theories of change. For example, I would like to mention Sweden's strategy for regional development cooperation in Asia and the Pacific, running up to last year, 2016 to 2021. We see that is the way forward. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation. I hope I haven't exceeded my time.
Fantastic. No apologies necessary. Thank you, Raphael. And coming from a international development aid donor background, I'm very interested in your reflections. So perhaps we can discuss all of that more. I mean, I won't attempt, I don't think, to summarize all of the perspectives, because I'm also really keen to hear from our audience about what you are most interested to discuss. But Jonathan, great context for the debate about the role of democracy in tackling environmental and climate challenges. Julia, great introduction of the multiple dimensions of justice and the human and non-human dimensions here. Melani, you were only just starting to touch on the critical point about the intersection of these democratic challenges with the energy crisis. I think that would be really interesting to explore too, and the challenges and opportunities, Raphael, that you raised in terms of making progress, working with governments on these issues. All so fascinating. I am going to take a step back, and I'd like to crack on with some of the great questions we already have in the chat. So what I'm going to say is, please, we've already got questions in the chat, so I'll start with them. If you would like to pop your camera on so we can all say hi, and pop your microphone on to ask your question, that would be nice. Make it more of a conversation than me reading it out, but it's totally up to you. And of course, if you don't want to, if you just want to put up your emoji hand, please feel free to join the conversation like that. But if it's all right, I will scroll back through the comments that I've been seeing coming in. Let's start with Miriam's question. Miriam, are you online, and would you like to?
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Over to you.
Hi. So thanks so much. For super interesting. My initial question was just sort of a feedback question for Jonathan. You mentioned, and I was curious, unprecedented steps that may be necessary to achieve democratic sustainable transformation. I was just wondering whether your research showed anything, what these unprecedented steps may be, what this may look like, or whether you have any thoughts on what that might be. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for your question, Miriam. And yeah, and in many ways, that is the big question. Where do we need to go beyond this? And I think Julia's presentation highlighted some of the further steps that we need to be thinking about. Some of the things that she flagged, and which I had been thinking about too, were things relating to, say, the representation of future generations, non-humans in decision making. And I suppose when we say unprecedented, maybe we're talking more about unprecedented in the context of many large-scale political systems, but of course they're not unprecedented in the sense of if we think of, say, many Indigenous societies, say have much more relational understandings of the relations between human and non-human. So in a sense, it's a question of can we enhance this representation in whether it's in terms of having commissioners for future generations and the like. So some of these institutions are, of course, already in place in various parts of the world, but we didn't necessarily, we weren't able to find explicit links to the connection between those innovations and environmental performance. I suppose there's a whole range of other things in relation to, say, economic transformation and the like, and I think Julia also highlighted, say, degrowth models and so on. So you may want to say a little bit more about those. Maybe just two brief points to highlight. One, as far as some interesting new thinking on some of these steps. Just been reading a book by a fellow Canberran, Tim Hollow, who's written this book, Living Democracy, which has some really quite interesting ideas on how we could rethink democracy along more ecological lines, sort of building in principles of interdependence, diversity, and so on. And so lots of interesting thinking there. But the other aspect, which I think is really important, is that question of the pathways for transformation. How can we actually get from where we are to a very different situation, both in terms of democracy and transformation? And does that pathway lead through some of the more established good practices when it comes to some of the practices that we highlighted in our evidence, right? Or is trying to embed those practices, focusing on, let's say, reducing the power of vested interests and political donations and so on. Is that really window dressing? Is it a distraction from a more wholesale change that's needed? Obviously, that's an open question.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, I may not go in chronological order because I will give Jonathan a break. We'll come back to the question from Johanna Saltis, but maybe I will go to Teresa Jed, as she has a question that may be for relevant to all of the panelists, actually. Teresa, are you there? And Teresa, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question of the panelists?
Sure. Hi, I'm Teresa Jed. I'm at the Technical University of Munich. And I guess at the time that I wrote my question, it was for Jonathan and Julia, but I think it does apply to everyone. My question has to do with difficult transitions. So how do we transition to more sustainable modes of governance when either an element of the general public or the elected leaders are explicitly in favor of discourses or practices that are unsustainable? So that is to say, how do we rectify a disconnect between elements of public opinion and elected leadership when we're engaging in a difficult transition? And I really appreciated Melanie's talk because I think that she gave an example of how you can actually do that. So as I was typing the question, it was sort of being answered, but maybe if we could hear from Melanie and the other panelists too on difficult transitions, I'd appreciate that. Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Teresa. And if it's all right, I will go to the panelists and start with Melanie, if you have a response on that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was a little careless with time before. I did have a little more to add. So yeah, so it was definitely difficult because what I experienced at the ground initially was for decision making, it was most of the existing activists, journalists, the people who've been working on the political sphere or the environmental, the social sphere that joined. But when the people, or when the occupants, interestingly, the occupation was called a village. It was a village in its true form. So the people wanted to get involved in decision making more. But also there were more and more challenges in terms of for people to understand the discussion that's going on. The language that was used was not comfortable, and also the long discussions or the arguments were tiring people, because for the ground level, mostly people were looking for answers. They were looking for explanations rather than long discussions based on political theories and philosophies, if you may. So with that, I think, like I've said before, it came to a point where one set of people wanted to go back into the top-down existing model. And then there was also people who didn't believe in that and who wanted a bottom-up model. So the challenges that I'm involved in the discussion to build people's councils in Sri Lanka. So the challenges is that there aren't the lack of information or the education about the topic itself. And there is also the stigma created about the people who are supporting the ideas, because these are existing activists or more left-leaning people with left-leaning ideologies. So they are sort of looked at as nuisance or troublemakers or disruptors. So the challenge is to, I think the biggest challenge is sort of working with these groups who already have very strong held opinions, and also getting participation from more youth and more public who do not have the same sort of level of ideologies or understanding into a middle. So that is what we are trying to do with initiating people's councils now, getting them both onto one platform and have the discussion started. We are still at very early forms. So I think it does take a lot of time, it does take a lot of patience, but and also navigating conflicts too, and it's a very diverse set of groups. It's definitely challenging, but I still believe that it is possible, because even with suppression, people being arrested, people being intimidated, these discussions and this initiation still go on. So definitely a challenge, but not a challenge that is not possible to overcome, I believe.
Really valuable insights. Thank you, Melanie. And the question's relevant to all the panelists. Would another panelist like to respond to the question from Teresa? Raphael.
Yep, if no one else is takers, thank you. Yes, well, very brief feedback. I mean, if the question is how to do this in a difficult context, I think that inevitably, I mean, thinking of our experience trying to answer this question, is that you can't avoid doing a proper political economy analysis, because it's extremely contextual. You need to go there. You need to understand what's happening exactly, and who is who, and what is what, and what needs to happen. And only when you have the full tapestry, you can have more or less creative ideas as to how you can get the ball to move in a certain direction. So once that you carry out a political economy analysis, you start seeing perhaps a little pathway that can get you there, regardless of the context. Of course, in the countries where we are active, the political economy analysis is likely to show that civil society doesn't have the capacity necessary to have the impact it needs to have as an agent of change and as an agent of awareness raising across the population in a way that is effective, and perhaps it doesn't have access to power either. But it really depends on the context. I mean, if we look at Europe and we look at the experiences of deliberative democracy that we're seeing of late in Ireland, in the UK, in France, in Spain as well. With the role of civil society there, well, it really has varied from country to country. In the UK and France, for instance, civil society, I'm thinking of the big one, what we call the big five, no? Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, etc. They understood that it was a challenging novelty, but they quickly understood what their niche would be. So they were part of it, and they made they did their best to ensure that it would be a success. They learned walking, but they did it. However, in Spain, I'm speaking as a Spaniard now, in Spain, these organizations were rather more hostile to the Citizens' Assembly being being meaningful. There are many reasons for this, of course, but in this case, empowering them wouldn't have helped at all. The roadmap would not take you necessarily through helping these organizations to have more impact, because the impact they had resulted in the assembly being weaker than it could have been if it had depended on the government's original intentions. So, political economy analysis. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Raphael. Now, other panelists, would you like to, Julia or Jonathan, respond on that briefly, or move on to the next question? Your prerogative.
Julia, let's hear. Did you want to mention anything?
Yeah, maybe give also a chance for another question.
Okay, Jonathan, I will. If you like, we will continue on that question, and then also I'll call on Johanna Saltis, who has a question directly for you as well, Jonathan. Is Johanna online?
Yeah. I'm on a different platform, so I don't have my chat anymore, but from memory, I think it was, I was curious, firstly, thank you for your talk, Jonathan. I was curious what eco-authoritarian, what was based on, like what examples, who in the world has practiced eco-authoritarian? Is that the term, Wendy? Because I don't have the chat.
No, sure. Sorry, I'm asking you to repeat the question that I had right in front of me. You asked Jonathan if he could say a bit more about where the eco-authoritarian approach has been used, and about unsuccessful outcomes that you'd mentioned.
Yes, because I think it's sort of playing into this top-down, bottom-up kind of idea that people have been raising. Julia's idea around transformation, Raphael's political economy, and Melani's top-down, bottom-up sort of approach. So, but also, I can't remember which speaker said it, that idea that what is eco-authoritarianism when in our democracies we have imposed views without First Nation voices? So is that eco-authoritarianism? Just being cheeky, I guess, there. But yeah, I was curious in your research what it was.
Sure. Yeah, happy to answer that. It's a really good question. I suppose if you like the sort of paradigm case that's often mentioned in the case of eco-authoritarianism is out of China, and the idea of, say, China's transition towards renewable energy. So I guess the eco-authoritarian argument goes something like this: well, democracies are too unruly. People are just, they have too many different opinions to be able to get with the project, as it were. So you really need some sort of centralized approach to say, we will achieve this transition, and then it's inconvenient dissent can be quelled, and so on. And so, people might point to, yes, there has been impressive progress in China's move towards renewable sources, later in solar energy and so on. But I guess there are some important caveats there, of course. So one being that, well, if we look to, say, the broader range of environmental issues that China faces, It's certainly by no means leading on many other like pollution challenges and so on. To the extent that authorities have acted on some issues, urban smog and so on, it's sometimes been in response to public concern about health impacts of smog, and it's not so much that this is necessarily a sign of democracy at work, but more a sign, say, of the regime being concerned about public order and so on, and feeling the need to do something about it. So I suppose that's often the eco-authoritarian poster child, if you like. But the evidence that we point to in the article really doesn't just include so-called eco-authoritarian states, but really authoritarian states across the board. So a lot of these studies that look at the connection between democracy and environmental performance will look at, let's say, 100 plus states. They'll be classified according to their democratic status. Do they perform better or worse on environmental indicators? And the results do vary across environmental problems. So democracies seem to clearly perform better on some environmental problems than others. Still debated about climate change performance. Do they clearly perform better, or is it more the case that there's no discernible trend? So generally what's found is, on average, we don't see authoritarian states performing better. They tend to be, often more beholden to large industry interests. They lack the kind of accountability for public accountability that might encourage them to respond to citizens' concerns about environmental problems and so on. So I hope that clarifies things a little. I guess on your final point about, say, could we, in the context where Indigenous voices aren't heard, is there's a kind of eco-authoritarianism. I'm not sure if I would entirely go as far as saying that, but I would say, well, that certainly points to a defect in the quality of our democracy. So if all voices are not being heard, then that's clearly a democratic failing. And maybe to link to a point from last week's Centre seminar, maybe once we have, as I very much hope, an Indigenous voice to Parliament in Australia, we might see some interesting developments there in terms of how the Parliament and our political system understands relations with the land. Democracy, of course, is important for lots of other reasons apart from its benefits for environment, but that's certainly an interesting area to look out for.
Great, thanks for the question, Johanna, and thank you, Jonathan. So I'm happy we're getting a good mix of questions to our different panelists, and the next one is for Julia. Marit, lovely to see you. I'm going to hand over to you to ask Julia your question.
Thank you, Wendy. Nice to see you too. I wanted to ask you about those paradigm shifts that you outlined that would be necessary for sustainability. Because I think they all sound great. I'm completely sympathetic, but I wondered whether I could kind of press you on justifying them a bit more clearly. Like why can we actually say that we need those things for sustainability transformation? And so specifically, I wanted to ask you about what you said about anthropocentrism and having to move beyond that to reconnect more with nature. So, I would have thought, anthropocentrism is opposed to ecocentrism. And so if you're saying, do we need to move beyond anthropocentrism, are you saying that sustainability transformation is actually an ecocentric project? Like it actually means moving beyond concerning ourselves with the sustainability of our human societies? Because if you just mean reconnecting a bit more with nature, I wonder whether that's actually something that could be consistent with anthropocentrism. Like it would be good for us humans to reconnect ourselves a bit more with nature. So to what extent really are you saying we need to move beyond anthropocentrism towards an ecocentric outlook altogether? And and why? What would be the justification for that being a necessary part of a sustainability transformation?
Thank you so much for your question and chance to elaborate on this. I think what is important also with regards to paradigms in general is that it's beliefs that are deeply enshrined in our society, is something also we aren't always aware of. And I think also when we talk about where we're going to head, that's also something that we cannot really decide on, because it's a process. And I think that's the core aspect of transformations, that it's emerging from the kind of interactions that we're having. But I think the analysis of the problem that we framed it as anthropocentrism, but this idea that humans can control nature, and this is kind of reflected all over society. So also when we look at our scientific systems, for instance, that we believe nature is something separate. For instance, when we look at the agri-food systems, new kind of varieties, for instance, are bred in laboratories rather than like in interactions of agroecological systems. So it's just one random example. It's kind of all over our systems, and I think that's what we need to move away from. And I don't want to specify too much where we're going to go, because I think that's very much should be a democratic process that emerges bottom up. But I think we certainly need to challenge this underlying paradigm that's spread all over society. And I think what captures as well is this phrase of or this expression of beyond human. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that we like give up our idea of humans and move completely to just nature. But it's questioning it and rethinking this relationship. Does that answer your question?
Great, thank you very much. Now I want to make sure that we have 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure that each of the panelists has a chance to make any overall reflections on all of the topics that have been raised by the other panelists, and any answers that they haven't had a chance to make. So I think in a moment, I would have, please put your hand up. I've been scrolling through the questions. There have been some brilliant questions and also comments. I want to make sure I haven't missed anyone. One question in the chat, Jonathan, is from Bernard, who, however, is no longer online. He's asked lots of detailed questions and apologizes that he had to slip out. And we'll see you in Toronto. So you'll have a chance to address those questions to him when we'll all see each other at Toronto. But perhaps I will take the chair's prerogative now and ask a question that I want to direct to all of the panelists, which is a broader question. I guess thinking about, what have we seen in terms of the way democracy has been playing out, maybe in the country where you're based or around the world. We've had a pandemic, we've had wars. What has this shown us, would you say, about the ability of democracies to help achieve sustainability transformations in the midst of all these other crises? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Do you think the experience of the last few years gives us more reasons to trust or actually mistrust the ability of democracies to deliver? So let me think. It's going to be, please, no more than 3 or 4 questions for each panelist so that we have time to wrap up as well. If you're happy with this approach, we'll go in the order of the panelists spoken. So if I can start by throwing to Jonathan.
Sure, thanks, Wendy. And yeah, I think it's fair to say that it's been a very mixed picture. Well, I mean, I suppose starting with Australia, my home country, we've seen a change of governments at the federal level just in the last few months, and we've seen Australia, say, lift its climate change target and also promised to overhaul a range of environmental laws. So maybe room for optimism there, but on the other hand, we do see a government that remains sort of heavily invested in coal and gas. Similarly, if I guess we look a little bit further to some other democratic societies, well, let's say India, world's largest democracy, would have its recently formalised net zero target, but again, India remains heavily reliant on fossil fuels as well. The US, we've seen the climate legislation pass, but a very divided society still, and so on. Right, we've seen the European deal, on the Green Deal on the one hand, but then we've seen lots of setbacks as a result of the war in Ukraine too. So the implications of some of these crises, the pandemic and so on, may vary over the short and long term. You know, the positive reading, let's say, of the impact of the war in Ukraine might be that, well, short term we'll see this this retreat back to coal and you know, reliance on gas from outside Russia, but longer term it will strengthen countries' resolve to shift to renewable sources, not just for climate reasons, but for energy security reasons. So yeah, so I think a mixed picture, and probably maybe a couple of things, you know, broad things. One is that even if we think that democracies are better equipped to achieve sustainability transformations compared to autocratic systems, that doesn't mean that we should be totally optimistic that that these transformations will be achieved, right? So yeah, there may well be another crisis around the corner, but you know, the ability of it to have any positive effects will depend on, well, how do we interpret the crisis? Do we interpret as a distraction from a focus on sustainability, or do we see it as a further reason to achieve sustainability transformation, right? I think some of that opportunity was lost with the pandemic, with sort of post-recovery packages. Means there were some good aspects, but maybe, but at least in Australia, you know, we were talking more about a gas-led recovery than a recovery towards renewables. Yeah, so I would say a bit of glass half full, glass half empty. But yeah, I'm interested to hear what others think.
Yeah, I won't ask you to place yourself exactly on a gauge, but thank you, Jonathan. Great answer. Can I throw to you, Julia, on that one?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I guess my perspective is also a bit mixed one. So I think we've been seeing a lot of shifts away from democracy, especially on the national level in many countries. For me, this is also a reason that we need more democracy, because I think these shifts are very much motivated by people feeling that they have no really efficacy, so they have no really impact on how decisions are taken, and that benefits these authoritarian movements or populist movements. So I think having more inclusive processes can actually help to overcome it, even though it might seem contradictory. But yes, what we are also seeing, and I think that's something to be hopeful about, at the same time, is that we are seeing more and more experiments in all kinds of democratic innovations, so more kinds of deliberative processes, for instance, on the national level, but also bottom-up initiatives, especially on community level. So what I would call real utopias of ecological democracy all over the world, that are showing us that it is actually possible to combine deep ecology focus together with highly inclusive procedures. And often these kinds of processes often also take place in like contexts on a national level that are quite anti-democratic or problematic. So, for instance, when we look at the Zapatistas in Mexico, or maybe one example where the national level is not this so problematic as in Bolivia, the Charagua. So they have created an autonomous self-government that kind of brings together more traditional indigenous perspectives together with more, well, I guess, Western understandings of electoral democracy, while also being highly ecological. So they emerged from protests against extractivist orientations as well. So I think we're seeing quite extreme examples on both sides, but I guess that's kind of what's happening all over society. So we have this polarization, but I think we can draw on these experiments bottom up also to mobilize more for changes on the national level as well.
Thank you, Julia. Melanie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I would say I am hopeful, even though, we managed to oust one president and now we have exactly the same module with a different face there. Because what I experienced was that the people of Sri Lanka who've been suppressed for so long, I mean, every time, there have been 2 or 3 uprisings within the 74 years since we became independent from the British rule. Every time they were suppressed, they were completely, crushed. But for the first time, people experience the true power of people. So I think that experience, this change is going to last. So that because of that, I am hopeful. But I do have a concern, if you may, in terms of looking at the global picture and how media and advertising impact people and decision making, and especially if you're talking about democracy, and when you're talking about deliberative democracy, how people's thinking and how the psychology behind decision making is largely influenced by media and advertising. There's almost no regulations in terms of monitoring those in Sri Lanka. So this doesn't just limit to one, just consumerism, but, going beyond greenwashing and political propaganda, all of that. So if we are to experience true democracy, I believe that it's needed, we need to look at the role played by media and advertising a little closer and understand the manipulation of emotions that is within this sort of the play. If we want people to make conscious decisions that are good for the people and the planet. If we can achieve that, I think, yes, definitely, then I'm definitely hopeful. Even though not, if we keep trying, anyway, it's going to be better than the alternative. We'll make life better, at least for some people and some part of the planet, at least. Yeah, at the planet, yeah. Thank you.
That's a great optimistic but also realist perspective. Thanks, Melanie. Raphael.
Thank you, Wendy. Well, we were, well, at least I was, incorrigibly optimistic that the pandemic economic recovery packages would be greenish, at least greener than business as usual. But we have seen that on the whole, they haven't been. We have some better examples, like, well, in the EU, for instance. It would be tempting to be a bit perhaps too partisan and say that this is a proof of the virtuous feedback loops between the quality of a democracy and its ability to be green, but I won't go there because the evidence is thin. But yeah, we'll have some better examples and some worse examples, but too many really to pick. But even worse, we have seen that in some countries, this COVID recovery legislation, which was often steamrolled through parliament without much debate and public participation, has been used as a Trojan horse to roll back environmental and social standards. And it has set these countries on a path that is incompatible with the delivery of their NDCs. So, for example, in Indonesia, we are working with the parliament to help them assess the impact of the famous omnibus law and see if the course defined by this pandemic response needs amending. I think that on the whole, it was a missed opportunity. I mean, speaking from Europe, as Jonathan was mentioning, we have been served yet another opportunity to reinvent ourselves as a greener continent faster than we had planned, as a response to Russia's weaponization of fossil fuels. And yes, the Repower EU package is quite substantial, but then you got the decision of gas and nuclear being ramped in as green technologies, at least as a bridge technology. But then, just this week, the news came out that this decision is going to be appealed. The Commission will be taken to court by Client Earth and Greenpeace for the lack of scientific evidence backing this inclusion. So it's a period of transition. It's hard to see a clear signal. Just watch this space.
Fantastic. 4 really great different angles on this question. I won't even try to summarize. I guess what I'm hearing is amid lots of kind of challenges and pessimism in terms of what democracy can look like and what it can do when we're tackling these huge challenges, there are also so many seeds of hope and really great tangible examples of people living democracy and doing things differently. I've been happy to hear about the different perspectives on what does democracy look like, and when we're talking about democracy, what do we mean? So before we close, we've got 5 more minutes, and before we finish up, I'm going to hand to Jonathan to talk a little bit about how we can continue to stay in touch, because I think it's fair to say this has been a really great conversation. One of the things that's great about it is not only hearing from the perspectives of our 4 fantastic panelists and the conversations that we've just started to get into, but just to note that it's lovely to have everyone online having these discussions, and these conversations will hopefully continue. So from the point of view of the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, we have a series of seminars, so please hop online and do sign up if you're not signed up already to get notifications about upcoming seminars. And of course, we have lots of things going on with the Earth System Governance Project at the moment. So can I hand over to you, Jonathan, before we thank everyone?
Sure. Yes, thanks, Wendy. I'll just pop something up on the screen, and maybe I can put it in the chat as well, which will have some links. But yes, so in terms of well, some of you may be familiar with both networks, but some more with one than the other. So we just thought, well, yeah, this is a good chance for people from one network to become a bit more familiar with the other as well. So so as far as getting involved with each of them, well, they both have very active Twitter feeds. So very much worth following. With the Earth System Governance Project, we're very open to new research fellows who might be interested to become involved in the network in one way or another. As Wendy and others have mentioned, we have an annual conference. The Toronto conference is coming up in October, and yeah, I will hope we'll see many of you there. We also have a range of task forces and working groups, including the Working Group on Democracy and Earth System Governance. So this is the working group that worked together on the paper I discussed earlier. And we we've been doing a range of collaborative projects, workshops and things over the years. We're very enthusiastic incoming co-conveners of the group, and we'll discuss those changes when we have our working group meeting in Toronto, but we also have an email list for updates and things on what the working group is up to. So yes, please consider getting involved in one way or another.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Yes, I'm always at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance seminars, and I'm very happy now to be a member of the Working Group for Democracy of the Earth System Governance Project. So I look forward to seeing lots of people online. Sadly, I'm not lucky enough to be travelling to Toronto, but we can participate in the working group meetings as well as the whole conference, right? Include it'll all be hybrid. Brilliant. Okay. Well, with that, I'd like to thank the people who've made today happen, and Jonathan Pickering has done a wonderful job at bringing together this concept and all of the panelists today. I'd like to thank Jane and Ailing in the Earth System Governance Project Office for helping set this all up, and Sahana and Ferds from the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance for making this Zoom event work. So many thanks to all of the people involved in making this happen, and very big thank you, of course, finally to our 4 panelists today. Thank you, Jonathan Pickering. Thank you, Julia Tschersich. Thank you, Melanie Gunatilaka, and thank you, Rafael Jimenez Aybar. It's been a fantastic conversation, and wishing you all the best.